Welcome to the space where creators have aligned a positive and intellectual collab of open minds. For sharing and learning from one another, it's a vibe. ReadswithRosa podcast on the mic. Subscribe, educator spitting bars. I guess you didn't know I'm multifaceted and humble, checking off life goals. The classroom is my comfort zone where I plant and sow seeds of knowledge, compassion, empathy, and hope. Reading is the key to unlocking your potential. Countless benefits, including cognitive and mental. Regardless of the genre, books are highly influential. Go get yours, I'll get mine. Making strides, monumental. Come rock with me and get down to this new jam. Reaching out to my friends, I had a very simple plan. Educate the masses through books and life lessons. It's the grand slam. I'm out.
Talo falava, malo elele, and welcome to the Reads with Rosa podcast. I am so excited to introduce today's guest. She is a writer of Tongan descent, and her work has been published in the Sydney Review of Books, SBS Voices, The Guardian, and Huffington Post, just to name a few. She is the General Manager of Western Sydney-based literacy movement Sweatshop, and the editor of several critically acclaimed anthologies. She is currently working on her debut novel. Welcome to the show, Winnie Dunn.
Oh,
How are you?
Malo Rosa. Thank you so much for having me. That's such a great intro. I don't feel like I need to introduce myself, but obviously just to shout out the fact that I'm Tongan. My family villages are Malapo, Golomotua, Golonga, and I'm from Mount Druitt, Western Sydney. So repping that 2770.
Yeah, shout out to the 2770 fam. Shout out to Mount Druitt. It's so good to see you, sis. So good to meet you. So nice to meet you. I'm grateful. Thank you so much for coming through.
So grateful to you. It's so great to talk to another Pacific Islander on this kind of platform. I think there's definitely room for us to get more involved in these kinds of things. So it's just so awesome.
Absolutely. How are you coping? Like, I know, I feel like, are we still living through this pandemic or what? I mean, how are
I
things
know,
going
right?
for you? Is it
Yeah,
back to normal or?
it's pretty much back to normal, but the flu season has come very early and quite hard. And so hospitals especially are quite nervous that because the flu season has come early, that the existing COVID cases and the rising flu cases will kind of make hospitals and all the people who work there and who've been working so hard for the last 2 years work even harder and at capacity, and they just don't have the resources to cater to everybody who could potentially get sick. And so I think in Sydney at the moment they're talking about getting free flu vaccinations. I've already got mine, which is good.
Yeah.
But that's where Sydney's at the moment.
Wow.
But we just got a new Labor government, so hopefully things will change for the better now that we've got a bit more of a left-leaning prime minister, which is great.
So in terms
And
of
how
like
are things
work,
in Japan?
oh man,
I should ask.
well, okay, so in Japan, I don't even know what to say, to be honest. Like, I feel like the pandemic has just never ended. Like, when we're talking about going back to normal, like, we have been wearing masks since, like, okay, so let me explain. Japan actually is, people wear masks. Like pre-COVID, people really wear masks everywhere they go. But, for a lot of us, it didn't really kick in like everyone has to wear a mask until the restrictions happened. But it feels like, going on nearly, 2 years now, it feels like not much has changed. Like we had some lockdowns, we had some state of emergencies, but like the other day, the prime minister was like, I think they were saying you can take off your mask when you're walking outdoors. But people would just stare. Like, it's like one thing to be like, yay, we can finally take off our masks. But then people give you the eye. Like, I don't know if it's safe as a foreigner to take off your mask. It's kind of like, in terms of being outside, everyone's still wearing masks. And I'm kind of nervous to go back home to New Zealand for summer vacation because I feel like people there are just not wearing masks. So that's a worry.
Such a different culture down here. Everyone's a bit, I think, too relaxed. I think maybe Japan's got it right.
I'm a bit nervous, but in school is a whole nother issue because our kids we've been wearing masks the whole COVID, all through the pandemic. During lunch, students are not. Anytime you eat lunch or you eat, you're not allowed to talk. So you can take your mask off, but you're not allowed to talk. So kids eat in silence. They play sports, they train with masks on, they sing, they play instruments with masks on. So that's just to kind of give you an idea. Like school is a whole nother stressful situation.
Oh, we're
But
getting
yeah,
babied over here. Those kids sound like they know what they're doing too.
so yeah, that's what's up here. But yeah, I don't know. I'm a bit nervous going home. Anyways,
Safe
you know,
travel, sis, when you go. It'll
thank
be all right.
you. Thank you, thank you. Usually I'd travel like pre-COVID, like to Australia. I'd like take like 5-day trips, like visit
Yep.
family and friends in Sydney or go to Brisbane. We can't really do that anymore. You got to get tested and all that kind of stuff
Yeah.
on our end. So
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, in terms of Winnie Dunn. Who is Winnie Dunn? Because I was so excited because I'm always looking for just Pacific Island folks who are just out there smashing it, like doing their thing, representing. And then I had actually come across Sweatshop. I think it was through Seller, and then like she had shared it, and then I discovered, whoa, there's a collection of writers. Wait a minute, you're not managers, Tongan. So I was just like, what?
Yeah.
I did a bit of research on you, and I was like, yo, your name is attached to a lot of work, anthologies and writing collections that have gone out. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to reach out to her. But anyways, we're going to get to all of that soon. But I guess, where does your love for writing or reading or where does that come from? Like, was it something, I don't know, that started in school, or was it later when you went to university?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So for me, as a Tongan, being the
Mm,
oldest child and the oldest girl comes with a lot of responsibilities. And so from a very early age, my dad especially taught me that, you need to be the one that goes out there, make sure she's looking after herself, because then therefore you're looking after your family. Like that kind of
mm,
teaching. And so from a very early age, I was taught to think for myself and do things for myself. But there was always this part of me that loved how words looked on the page, and the act of uh, writing something down with a pen on a
mm,
piece of paper, whether that was a sentence or even a bit of scribble. As a kid, I would read the backs of toilet paper packets, just because there was no other reading material in the
right.
house. I would find scraps of paper or doodle in the corners, you
Mm,
know, of little things, because for me, the way that I think about it is the way that African American feminist and scholar Bell Hooks talks
mm,
about this innate spirit of writing, that some are just innately called to the
mm,
spirit of writing and critical thinking and literature. It's an unknown force, I think, and some people are just, I think, born with the, I guess, calling to go to that spirit of writing. And so I really take Bell Hooks's teachings on that, because it was just something innate that I
mm,
had in me, this desire to read and write. And it was only when I went to university, I was the first person in my family to go to university, that I started critically thinking about what literature is, what writing is, what the act of writing means, especially when, like, we come from oral storytellers.
mm,
Our people back in the day didn't didn't write on paper, didn't read on paper. We were painting on knuckle. We were telling stories to each other orally. And so how could I mesh those two things together? How could I take the oral storytelling traditions from Tongan culture and pair it with this ancient act of reading and writing that's not only Western, but that comes from different parts of the world, like the Arab world in particular, has, I think we're kind of the first people to use paper, and so um, for me, my love of writing, I think, and reading is something innate that I was just born with, but it's a skill that I developed over time. And especially meeting Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed, the founder of Sweatshop, learning to think critically about not only what it means to read words on the page, but how to pull them apart and make meaning out of them. So that's kind of my history with reading and writing and critical thinking.
Since you mentioned Dr. Muhammad, let's touch on let's go there right now. Since you mentioned it, in terms of Sweatshop, like how did you? Yeah, like how did you met Dr. Muhammad? Was it through your studies? Like how did you actually become an editor, or did you start off as a writer and then eventually, how did it begin for you at Sweatshop?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was the first person in my family to go to university, and with that again comes a lot of responsibility to kind of be the person who could go into that space, the first person in my family to go into that space. I felt this drive to get my degree and be the best student that I could be and take all the knowledge that I could, because I knew that my parents and my siblings and my aunties, they didn't have the opportunity to do those things. It seemed to me that I was going to be the only one who was going to get this opportunity, so I had to make the most of it. And so during my university days at Western Sydney Uni, I took up extra classes. I did all the extracurricular activities. Like I was constantly in the library reading the recommended reading list that the tutors would give me. That was not mandatory reading.
Right.
It wasn't on my course list, but I just took everything that I could. And so the way the way that I met Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed was I went to a writing class that my student newspaper was running in the evening, and a friend of mine at the time took me because she I had told her I was interested in writing and writing stories, but I just felt like I didn't know how to do that, or didn't have the time to do that, but it was something we were both interested in because she was studying to be an editor at the time. So we went to the student newspaper workshop. I walk in, I see this guy who basically looks like the guy up my street. Like it's
the neighbor.
It's this brown, yeah, he looks like my neighbor. He's this brown guy in flared jeans and a Nike cap.
Right.
And TNs, Nike TNs, and he's teaching about literature. He's showing me writing that was written by young brown people from Western Sydney. And he was explaining to me how that kind of writing is a form of literature. And what we mean by literature is writing that creates an original contribution to knowledge. Like kids from my hood were writing original contributions to knowledge that nobody had ever heard before, right? Because they were just talking about their own lived experiences. And it's something that Australia in particular has yet to reckon with, the marginalized people of this nation, who have so many stories to tell and have been telling our stories, but are just not given the opportunity because Australia still touts itself as this very monocultural society that's just full of beaches and bushland and blonde hair and blue eyes, I'm sure if you ask somebody in Japan what Australia was, that's what they would think of.
Yeah.
So,
surfers.
yeah. And so meeting Muhammad in that space just opened my eyes to the richness of marginalized stories in Western Sydney, particularly by First Nations people and people of color. And so I went up to him after the workshop like a complete nerd, and I was like, "Can I have your reading list?" and then he looked at me and he was like, "Well, well, you look like something. Why don't you join Sweatshop? And I'm like, what do you mean by something? And he's like, you look like you've got some culture in you.
Yeah.
Like there's something happening. And I go, oh, I'm Tongan. And he was just like, what? Because obviously I don't look Tongan because
Right.
you know I'm mixed race and you know,
Yeah.
that comes with a lot of privileges. And so I just laughed. But looking back, I realized it was actually the first time I had ever told somebody in a university setting that I was Tongan, because I
Mm.
feel like in institutional settings they like to pretend that race doesn't exist, and it's not a barrier to getting into the institution, but also graduating from the institution.
Mm.
So that's how I met Sweatshop. So I did a couple of writing workshops with Mohammed. His first piece of advice was that I couldn't write and I needed to go back and start again, sentence by sentence, you know. So that's what I did. And then from there, I got offered a small paid internship, which in Australia in the arts is quite rare.
Mm.
I'd actually had no job up until that point, because I went from high school to university, and I just was at university full time as a and not working, and so getting a job was quite um, foundational for me in terms of setting up my own independence as an individual. And so yeah, and then kind of the rest is history. Then I got mentored by Mohammed, started making all these books, started mentoring people myself, and really creating a culture of empowered First Nations people and people of color in Western Sydney to tell their own stories.
Wow. I have just a gazillion questions
Humble
going on
brag,
in my
not
head.
you know.
I'm like, wow. I mean, oh goodness me. Oh, give me a moment. I need to collect myself. I was just like, bam, bam, bam. What? That is
That's very sweet of you.
amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, you have the job as you're the general manager of Sweatshop. Do you, as part of your job, that because I know, okay, so Sweatshop, you run programs there. I mean, there are different collectives. There's a women's writing group, there's a writers collective, you have a schools initiative. There are all these really cool things that Sweatshop does. And then in terms of your role, what does that entail aside from working closely with your writers?
Yeah, so Sweatshop at its core is a grassroots organization, and it
Mm,
is founded on the principles of, again, African American feminist and scholar Bell Hooks,
mm,
and obviously Malcolm X, who's behind me. Um, because degrees of Bell Hooks says degrees of literacy determine how we see what we see. And so
mm,
the idea of Sweatshop is to um, go into schools, like I go into schools and we teach literacy. And what we mean by literacy is not just reading and writing.
right.
What we mean by literacy is critical. Just see a bunch of beachgoers having some weekly drama, or do you see a form of white supremacist fantasy that says that Australia is a monocultural country where white people are at the center? Or are you somewhere in between that? And so we try to give forcibly marginalized people, meaning First Nations people and people of color, the tools to start thinking critically and seeing things in empowered ways. And so,
Mm,
yeah, so that means like going to schools in Western Sydney where there's a lot of disadvantaged
mm,
young children who are the next generation. And so we try to foster the next generation of writers. Obviously, I work with a lot of writers who are adults who are wanting to tell their own story and learn the craft of writing, because
mm,
what I don't want people to get confused is that just because you're a person of color and you have a story, that's not enough. Like you have to be in training, and just like any job, you have to be in training to learn the skills and the crafts that it takes to be a great writer. And so we
mm,
just don't want I personally just don't want the writers that I mentor to say it's enough that I'm a person of color and I have a story. I'll just tell it however I want. It's more like think critically about that stuff, but also think critically about your craft as an artist and how you want to shape yourself as an artist that stands out from other writers in the industry. So there's that. As the general manager, there's also boring stuff like admin, a lot of emails. And outside of my work as general manager, I'm a freelancer because Sweatshop is an organization that was created by artists for artists. So myself and Mohammed as the founding director, we're also writers in our own right. And so we work at Sweatshop part-time. And then the rest of the week, we're kind of working on our own writing. So that's how I was able to kind of fit in my editorial work through Another Australia. And obviously, as the general manager, it's also about networking, meeting other writers, setting up really important relationships, setting up friendships. And so with Another Australia in particular, I was just able to call upon or invite my mentors, my peers, and my friends who are kind of exceptional First Nations writers and people of color writers, award winning, and so that's how I was able to kind of fit my editorial work with Another Australia. But yeah, being a general manager is just a title. It's just kind of like whatever comes my way is whatever comes my way, and I'll do it.
In terms of like, because as an educator, I'm always curious about representation with books in schools. I really love how you really emphasize just then that the importance of honing your craft, like really working on your craft, right? As opposed to anyone can just put a book out there without, do you know what I mean? So I love that you really emphasize that because I think it's important for people to know, right? In terms of the work in schools, how is it received from, young people? Like, are they interested? Are they excited that there are stories being told by Indigenous and First Nations BIPOC people, BIPOC folks? Are they excited about that? Are there students who are just kind of like curious and wondering why? Do you know what I mean? What's some of the feedback or like interesting questions that you've had from some of the students that you've worked with?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, Sweatshop works in schools in Western Sydney, which is predominantly like it's such a large area in Sydney, but it's most of what's Western Sydney is predominantly at a socio and economic disadvantage. And so there's a lot of intersections when we meet these kids, and we try to teach them about writing. The question I get asked the most at the beginning of the workshop, because Sweatshop does it for a whole term, and for the last 3 years, I think this is the third year, we've actually partnered with Campbelltown City Council, which is a suburb in southwestern Sydney that's growing, but has always been in a very has always been disadvantaged socially and economically. So when we go into schools in Campbelltown for the term once a week, at the beginning of the term, the first question I get asked by students is, why would anyone care about my story? And it's such a heartbreaking question to hear. But I feel like even the students asking me that is a form of trust, because I also am a brown kid who came from a low socioeconomic area. Mount Druitt in particular is kind of haunted by this documentary series called Struggle Street, which was made by SBS a couple years ago, and the opening credit of Struggle Street, that first season that's set in Mount Druitt, the opening credit of that scene is you're opening up to this very picturesque Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House, the icons of Australia. It then zooms through the city, and you end up at a sign that says "Welcome to Mount Druitt." and then someone farts. Like, yeah, like Mount Druitt, the suburb that I grew up in, was seen as the arse end of Sydney, you know, where all the kind of, for lack of a better term, shit kickers live, you know. And so when the
Man.
students in those schools ask me that question, like, why would anybody care about my story? They're still seeing themselves in me as their mentor, because they see the a brown woman from Mount Druitt who was able to make a career out of writing, and was able to um, find that form of empowerment for herself. And so Bell Hooks talks about it too, the act of
Mhm.
mirroring, how empowering the act of mirroring can be, seeing yourself represented in higher forms of society, or jobs, or whatever it may be, then empowers the next generation to say,
Mm.
there's a pathway for me to get there. And so the kids at the beginning of the term, they ask me, why would anybody care about my story? I say, I care. Let's try to craft your story. Let's see how we go. We work through the term. And by the end of the year, honestly, every student that we work with is like, being a writer is really cool. Like, I loved being able to tell my own story. I liked being able to put sentences together. I liked being able to kind of swear in my stories. I
Right.
swear in the playground, but the teachers are like, we can't do that, you know. And so it's always a fun time in the schools to see the kids develop their literacy, to have higher degrees um, of literacy, to then determine how they see what they see. So at the beginning, they don't see themselves. By the end of the term, they're seeing themselves everywhere and wanting to write it down.
That's I love hearing stories like this as a teacher. It's like I get it. Like I get that so much. And I really wanted to just kind of run it back to when you mentioned that the first time that you actually said you were Tongan, um, was at university. And I wonder about, you know, the work in schools, connecting with different writers from various backgrounds. And how has this work kind of helped you in terms of um, your identity and knowing who you are and being really confident in who you are as a Tongan woman or at mixed race, like does any of yeah does it I mean yeah that's just something I was thinking about as you were
Oh,
like
yeah,
talking.
it's such a good question. I mean, to bring it back to Bell Hooks's argument about mirroring and how important it
Mm,
is to see yourself represented in mainstream forms of um, media and art. Uh, in Australia, in particular, when I was growing up, the only representation of Tongan Australians that I had in mainstream television was Chris Lilly, who
oh
we
my
all know is
god,
the
oh my
guy who
god.
did the brown face and the afro wig and enacted these really racist, homophobic, violent misrepresentations, I call them,
Mm,
of young Tongan men, boys, like children, and
mm,
also Pacific Islanders on a broader scale. And so that was very, very disempowering for me as a young mixed race Tongan woman growing up in Western Sydney. And so I developed a very large sense of self-hatred, to the point where my family members would call me Fia Palangi, which means wanting to be
mm,
white.
right.
That was my nickname. Like, they would call me that, like,
Mm,
as my name, because seeing somebody like Chris Lilly on my TV, who was his show was the most popular in
mm,
2007 when it came out when I was 12. Um, of course I was going to develop this sense of self-hatred if that's the only thing I was seeing on TV. And so it took me a long time to realize that um, being Tongan um, and having my story is beautiful. Like, it is a beautiful, complicated thing, and
mm,
that in a fortunate but also unfortunate way, I have to be the one to start changing that
yeah,
narrative And there's other Pacific Islanders doing it, like Professor Georgie Ravulo, for instance, who's the first Pacifica professor in Australia. There's people like Sella, who I think you showcased last week, who are out there changing the narrative. And so it's still early days in Australia. Like even in Aotearoa in New Zealand, there's a ton more representation of Pacific Islanders in Aotearoa, because the political climate is different there, especially when you're considering that the Indigenous population in Aotearoa is Māori, who are not only Indigenous to First Nations to New Zealand, but also Pacifica as well, and we share Pacifica or Oceanic, as Professor Ipeli Huofa calls it, that oceanic connection. And so it's still early days in Australia, unfortunately. But the idea is that, my work in writing and editing and mentoring and literature is not just for me, but it's for everyone. It's for people of color, and it's for other Pacific Islanders who need to tell their story. Because I only have my one individual story, and I'm mixed race, so let's use that to open the space and have more Pacifica Australian writers tell their own story. There's a incredible poet and writer at Sweatshop. Her name is Christina Foa. She's Samoan.
Right.
Yeah, she's from Southwest Sydney, and she's writing such incredible work. Like you can see it on Straight Up Islander. She's written a ton of articles about what it means to grow up as a Samoan Australian woman in Western Sydney, and our story, where our community is growing, but still early days in Australia.
Man, man, thank you. I'm just taking this all in, and I'm just trying to learn.
And just shout out to in another Australian in particular, which is why we're talking, Anne Marie Tewil, who is Māori Australian, and she wrote this amazing poetic essay about her great uncle, who was unfortunately and sadly hung by the Crown of New Zealand, and kind of the last Māori man to be hung by the Crown of New Zealand, and was executed unjustly. And so her work in particular, I think, when I asked her to come in, was so important, because again, the underrepresentation and misrepresentations of Pacific Islanders in Australia, the lack of Māori voices that we're hearing in Australia, even though Aotearoa is so close to us, so when I invited her in particular and she said yes, like it was just so wonderful to have, not only me as a Tongan being the editor, but another Pacifica coming in another Australia to tell their own story. And I'm also quite proud of the cover as well of Another Australia.
So let's talk about Another Australia. That's actually next. Let's talk about that, because you are the editor for Another Australia, the anthology, published by Affirm Press. I'm going to shout out, in partnership with Sweatshop Literacy Movement and association with Diversity Arts Australia. This is going to drop May 31st. Congratulations. That's next week, next Tuesday. But it's a collection that features fiction, non-fiction poetry from 12 boundary pushing Indigenous writers and writers of color who reveal another Australia hidden behind, beneath, beside the country that I guess outsiders, what we think we see and know, right? Tell us about, you've already mentioned, how did you get these amazing writers on board? How did you reach out to them? Did you know of them already? Were they already doing workshops with Sweatshop?
Yeah, so the writers for Another Australia that I worked with Some of them were writers at Sweatshop. So the incredible Shirley Lee, who's a Vietnamese Australian writer from Southwest Sydney, Sarah Saleh, who's an award-winning Arab poet, who's also part of Sweatshop, Amani Haider, again an award-winning writer who wrote The Mother Wound, and is really paving the way in shaping the conversation around domestic violence in Australia to centre women of colour, which I think is integral when we have those conversations. But a lot of the writers in particular were people that I looked up to, who I kind of saw as my mentors, who were actually leading the way before I even came into the industry. So multi-award winning author of Song of the Crocodile, Nadi Simpson, wrote these beautiful sections completely in the Yuwullerai language, like completely in First Nations language, which is the actual language and sound of Australia, and particularly her country where she's from. That's the actual language, it's the actual sound. But so it's like breaking this myth of Australia as these kind of rednecked bogan farmers in the countryside who are farming kangaroos. It was her work in particular was so foundational to the rest of the anthology. There's also people like Sasonke Misamang and Osman Faruqi, who's a really well-known and respected journalist here in Australia, and them talking about what it means to create a new pathway to solidarity between non-Indigenous people of colour living and benefiting from settler colonialism, and our relationships and our obligations to the First Nations people whose countries that we live on. It's also just people I admired as well, who are not necessarily writers, like the rapper and producer El Fresh the Lion.
That's why I had to ask. I was like, just these different people that you have brought together just to contribute something super special. I was like, how did she do that? Like,
I mean,
emails, connections.
Obviously Sweatshop and Affirm Press and Diversity Arts were a big part of that, in terms of me establishing those connections very early on in the work that I was doing previously for Sweatshop anthologies, such as Sweatshop Women and Racism and The Big Black Thing. So, there was a lot of groundwork before then, kind of setting everything up, paying my dues, I would say. And then by the time that I got the invitation from Affirm Press to kind of edit the standalone sequel to Another Australia, because it's a sequel to After Australia, which was released to such critical acclaim when it came out, and was so groundbreaking in the way that it imagined the future of Australia, that when I got the invitation to do Another Australia, I kind of had the next 12 writers who were going to reflect upon the present of Australia and the present myths of Australia and the present problems of Australia, because we are living in such a tumultuous, volatile time that it just felt that the standalone follow up to After Australia it just seemed quite natural to be like, okay, we've envisioned the future, we've challenged the future, but how can we challenge our present? How can we stay in this kind of shaky moment that we're in and find new stable ground again? So all the 12 writers did such a exceptional job in terms of revealing both a new and an ancient side of this very complicated continent.
Let's talk about this amazing, beautiful cover. Who is responsible? Who did you reach out for that cover?
So it was somebody on the Affirm Press team, but obviously as an editor, I'm not contributing to my own book that I'm editing. My contribution is the way that I've put the writers together, the certain writers I've chose, the way that the stories line up. So that's my contribution as an editor. But obviously, as a writer, I wanted to kind of sneak in my own contributions and my own forms of representation, because again, like we've been talking about in Australia in particular, even though the Pacific Islander community in Australia is so well known. I mean, we only make up 1% of the population, but we're so well known by everybody that it seems surprising almost that we're not represented in mainstream forms of art and literature. So obviously for this book, as an editor, I had to make my own contributions somewhere. And so for the cover, I wanted to center a strong, gender fluid Pacific Islander who is center frame, who is taking up space, because that's the reality. That's the reality of Australia. We're not monocultural. We're not blonde-headed, blue-eyed beachgoers. We're so diverse, and we're not this just grateful migrant, successful multicultural country that kind of this fantasy of whiteness in Australia, which is a term that Lebanese Australian professor Professor Ghassan Haj uses, the fantasy of white supremacy in Australia. We're not that. It is a fantasy. White people, Anglo people are not at the center of Australia. We're simply just very diverse as a country, as a continent, as a nation. And so, yeah, on the cover, I wanted to make sure that we were represented, that there was a Pacific Islander there. You'll also see in the background there's a woman in a hijab, and there's this kind of ambiguous brown guy throwing up like the Tupac West Side sign, you know.
I was like, genius,
because
who did this? Who put this together? I was just like, I love this.
Because that's the reality of Australia. And so obviously I gave a firm press a lot of direction and a lot of advice about how I wanted the cover to be, because the cover of After Australia, the first anthology, is controversial in its own right, because it has the scribbled out faces of blonde-headed, blue-eyed beachgoers, which is kind of, again, scribbling out that white supremacist fantasy that like white people are at the center of conversations around race and identity, and they're not. We're all in a talanoa together. We're all in a circle about race and identity and what that looks like in Australia. There's no one at the center of that conversation. We're all trying to talk to each other. And so I feel like that's the spirit of After Australia and Another Australia, that we're showcasing that no one is at the absolute center of conversations around race and identity and those intersections. We're all trying to have a conversation together. And if anybody's at the center of those conversations, it's actually First Nations people. So, yeah.
That's right. Louder for the people in the back. Thank you. Louder. People in the front and the back. Yes.
Yeah. I was also quite proud of another contribution that I was able to make, the I think it's epitaph of the book, which is a Tongan proverb, and obviously excuse if I butcher it.
That was my next question.
Speak Tongan. Yeah.
Yes,
Tu'upela mo e popo, which is like being prepared for any eventuality. And when we're talking about what the reality of Australia is, there's so many different realities. There's so many stories, because we all come from different walks of life, and we all come from different experiences and cultures, and and so it's like when we have those talanoas, when we have those conversations around race and identity, when we humble ourselves to the sovereignty of First Nations people here in Australia, that's us preparing for any eventuality that is happening and that could happen to us as First Nations people and people of color. Because there's been so many conversations over the last 2 years about how strange the world is becoming, and it's only going to get stranger because of climate crisis and war and violence, all of these things that keep circulating and perpetuating themselves. And so I was also quite proud, obviously, as a Tongan woman, to be able to also showcase the Tongan language and lessons ancient lessons that us Pacific Islanders have been teaching to each other for millennia. You know, that's something I wanted to give to broader Australia. That's my original contribution to knowledge. Here's this ancient lesson that our people have been teaching to each other that we all need to start considering as we move forward in such a tumultuous time.
You know, right at the beginning, when we were talking about, your Tongan heritage, I was wondering about storytelling. You know, we know that our people are storytellers. And in terms of your upbringing and, you know, the connection to the Tongan language, like, where were you hearing it? You know, because it makes me think about the role of women, like in Tongan society and Tongan families, and just you know, women are revered, and it's so important the role that they play. So, you know, were you hearing stories from your, you know, from those strong women in your life as you were
Yeah.
growing up?
So obviously we've been talking about it, and obviously everyone can see like I'm mixed race, and so
Mm,
but I don't have any white relatives. So the white relatives that I do have, or technically, kind of excommunicated themselves from my family, and that's because when my grandmother lived in New Zealand for a little bit, she was, as the oldest child and the oldest woman in her family, which is kind of the top structure of your family when it comes with the most responsibility. She was asked by her fahu, her
yeah.
maidanga, like her leader of her family, to marry this white guy from England who was in New Zealand at the time, who showed an interest in her. And she said no, she didn't want to do it. But her fahu was said to her, you know, there's nothing left for us in Tonga. We have to move forward. It's an unfortunate, I think, stereotype and a disempowering story that our people get told, but that's what she got told. And so her fahu was like, I'm your fahu, you have to marry him. You have to marry him so that you can get all of our family into Australia, because that's where things are growing, that's where things are happening. So my grandmother said, okay, like I can't disobey you.
Mm,
Like you're technically my mum. You're actually
mm,
higher than my mum, so I got to listen to you. And so that's what my grandmother did. She was basically arranged to marry this white guy, and she did. And they moved to Australia in the time where the white Australia policy was just ending, right?
oh,
So
right.
she lived in quite a volatile racial time where white people in Australia were very much so the dominant supremacist
Mm,
structure, and so she faced a lot of racism in her time, very overt racism, I would say. They had
mm,
4 kids, um, and then by the time she was able to use her husband from England to get all of her family to Australia, she just had enough and said, we need to get divorced, because he was like, well, I've done all this for you. You got to come back to me and live with me in England. She was like, no
mm,
way. Like, we just brought my family over here. I'm not leaving my family for you.
mm,
And so he's like, okay, I'm going to leave you. And so when he left, my estranged biological grandfather left, my grandmother went back to Tonga. She married the like darkest skinned Tongan you could ever imagine. And just set up life in Australia. And so, you know, I owe my existence to my grandmother, obviously to my estranged grandfather, even though he wasn't in my life. But I really owe my life and my existence to my grandmother, who made all those sacrifices, you know,
mm,
before even her children were born. Like, she made so many sacrifices to ensure that we had the best opportunities. And then again, you know, my fahu, who I'm named after, who is the oldest girl in her family, you know, she taught me how to be. She tried her best when I was young. I was very resistant at the time, but always as a kid, she was teaching me the beauty in the complicated nature of what it means to be mixed race Tongan Australian living in Australia, because that was her as well. And she was living in a time where Pacific Islanders were still coming into the country, and where being mixed race was still a new idea or a new concept, you know, because she was growing up mixed race Tongan-Australian in like the 80s. My dad too, you know, it was still a new weird time for mixed race kids to be running around. Now we're everywhere.
Right.
But you know, that's my matriarchal story. You know, I had my grandmother who made all those sacrifices, who I would sit out with on Sunday afternoons on the knuckle that was 20 feet long, spread out across the front yard, you know, and her painting away in the sun. You know, I was there for fuck a man in the middle of church, you know.
Wow.
Doing all those things. I was there with my auntie, with her trying to teach me Tongan values and culture, and the voice and the responsibilities and the obligations that I had as the oldest child and the oldest girl out of my 8 siblings, you know.
Wow.
So yeah, definitely the matriarchal structure in Tongan culture played out in my own life, and I'm just so indebted to my grandmother and my fahu, who taught me the strength of being who I am.
What makes a great editor? I mean,
that is such a good question. What makes a good editor is the ability to pull words apart and make meaning from them. So the ability to pull somebody else's words apart and find the deeper meaning as to what it is they're actually trying to say. And then asking myself, is the writer saying what I think they're trying to say in the best way possible? Because it's not about what you can and can't do in writing. It's about whatever you're doing in your writing, are you doing it the best? Is it an original contribution to knowledge? Are you playing with language in a new and innovative way? Are you telling a story that nobody else is telling before? And are you telling it in an expertly crafted way? And so for me, what makes a good editor is that ability to pull words apart, make meaning out of them, and get the writer that you're working with to dig deeper, to then create the best possible work that they could make. And so a lot of my notes to the writers was just like, what do you mean by this? And when you say, do you mean this? Can you dig deeper about this? Or I think you mean this. Is that what you're meaning? Or is there a more economical way that could come across? You know, what's the story behind this? So just a lot of questions, being curious, to get the writer to showcase the best of their craft.
Have you ever clashed with a writer? Because obviously the editor and writer, you've got to work closely together, and I guess got to keep communication open, and you've got to be willing. Because the reason why I ask is I wonder, you know, if a writer is just pouring their heart and soul into something and they see it in a particular way, but you're coming in with like, hey, what about? So I wonder if you've like clashed. Professionally, of course, professionally.
No, of course. No, obviously I'm not. I don't have a hit list. I'm going to name names. No. But the only clashes I've experienced is actually with emerging writers who don't see writing as a job. They see writing as a form of therapy. And writing can be a form of therapy, but I am not a therapist. Like, I am not trained in the profession of therapy. Like, I can be sympathetic, I can be empathetic, but I cannot help you as an editor solve your trauma. And writing can only help you through a trauma to a certain extent. So the only clashes I've ever experienced is with emerging writers who only see writing as a form of self-soothing, because it's actually a job. Like, if I hired a plumber and I told them to fix my pipes, and they came into my house and they said, oh, I don't want to fix the pipes because, like, the pipes are making me cry, and so I don't want to fix them. But can we just leave it? Can we leave your sink overflowing, and can we have the pipes bursting just because it's making me upset that that the pipes are burst? Like, can we do that? No, that would not be that's not appropriate in any other career, you know. I would laugh at you, and I would say, bro, like, I hired you to do a job. I need you to do the job. And and if I was a plumber who had like 20 years of experience, I'd be like, this is how you fix it. It's not an answer for you to just tell me, oh no, the pipes are making me upset today, I don't want to do it. Because so the only clashes I've ever experienced is with those emerging writers who don't necessarily appreciate that writing is a job, and being a good writer is very hard, and only a few people can go all the way in terms of learning the craft of writing and the fabric, the complicated fabric of writing and literature. For any of those writers who I've have clashes with, or for any writers who are hearing this and want to know how to just not see writing as me just pouring my heart out, I would definitely recommend the essay Bad Writer that was written by the founding director of Sweatshop, Dr. Michael Muhammad Ahmed, because it really sets up how Sweatshop works and how Sweatshop operates, but also how to respect the craft of writing. Because I feel like to be a successful writer, that's what you also have to see. Writing is not just about pouring your heart out and pouring your story out. Writing is a job, it's a career, it's a craft. And so you want to also be open to learning that knowledge as much as you want to learn how to tell your own story and speak from the heart and dig really deep. You also want to be competent and confident in your work.
That leads us very nicely into this next part, because you are working on your debut novel. It's going to be published next year. Can you share a little bit about how that journey is coming along?
Yeah, of course. So it will get announced soon. So I'll just tell you early. I have signed with the multinational publisher Hachette here in Australia for 2 novels. The first novel they signed me on. Thank you. They signed me on a 30,000 word manuscript that's titled Dirt Poor Islanders, and it is a form of autobiographical fiction, loosely based on my own lived experience, but fictionalized. So it's about a young narrator named Leah, who's in a very complicated, clashing family of mixed race islanders, of full Tongans, of Tongans who are born in Tonga, Tongans who are born in Australia, all of them living in low socioeconomic suburbs in Sydney, and her trying to find her own strength and identity in those personal clashes. And the novel is really about showcasing the lived experiences of Pacific Islanders in Australia that I saw in particular. Because again, like we were saying, like we were talking about earlier, Chris Lilly is the only representation. So how can I showcase that beautiful complicatedness of the Pacific Islander experience in Australia in the way that I saw it, so that we can move away from the misrepresentations that have been haunting our community for over 10 years now.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm so excited. Exclusive.
Thank you. I'll send you I'll get my publisher to send you a copy when it comes out. But I gotta finish it first, because like
Thank you. So like, honestly though, in terms of so that's that's the writing. How are you feeling? Like, I mean, are you excited? Are you nervous? Are you like debut novel? I mean, what kind of emotions are
Yeah.
you
Oh,
experiencing?
well, look, like I feel a bit anxious talking about it because I was still yet to finish the thing. Like I'm currently still writing it,
Mm,
and I'm writing a paragraph a day,
mm,
um, for now to try and get the momentum going again. Because the first 30,000 words took me 5 years to write, and so the idea that I
wow.
got to write another 30,000 words in 8 months is quite overwhelming. But a paragraph a day, one step at a time. That's how you get things done. So yeah, I am feeling very excited. I am feeling quite nervous. Obviously, you would know this in Pacific Islander culture, it is very rare to talk about yourself in such a
Right.
public way and to use your own stories in such a public way. Like we're in Tongan, you always kind of start your phrases or your words like in public with "dulo," like you're excusing
Mm,
yourself for existing almost. And so I I I really understand the privileges that I have in my own life to be able to talk about my own lived experiences in a fictional way and to vocalize my lived experience in such a public way. So I am humbled, I am excited, I am nervous. And as people of color writers, they often talk, there's this conversation happening about how do you tell your family about this stuff, right?
right.
And I told myself that unfortunately only my whahul, who I'm named after, knows about it and can hear about it, because I just don't think the rest of my family would be able to come to terms with my work. But I'm hoping, 10, 20 years from now, they can see the importance of it and the significance of it when they're ready, because people are only ready in their own time. And so, yeah, there's also a sadness as well, but it's all very exciting, and I am very privileged. And, I have so many people who have supported me
Mm.
on my journey to writing a novel. And so I couldn't have done it, without the help, you know, that I'd received. So I can only ever pass it on for the other writers. So yeah.
Wow, that's yeah. What does your workspace? You've mentioned a paragraph a day or so. What does your workspace look like? Do you write in a particular space in your home, or is it you have to leave home to do it somewhere else? How do you get the creative juices flowing?
Yeah, I'm such a hermit, which is so like not very Pacific Islander of me, but I am such a hermit, and so I honestly sit here like
Yeah.
where we're talking now, and I just write like a paragraph a day, or I write when I'm traveling on
Mm.
the train. So I find being in motion. Like maybe that's the actual Pacific Islander part of me,
Yeah.
being in motion. I'm able to write like in a busy train. But I remember growing up, because I only moved out of home last year, but when I was living at home with my parents and my siblings, like all eight of us in a one-story house, all cramped together, I was writing my assignments and writing my short stories and my articles and my essays all in my little single bed in my
Mm.
little tiny shoebox bedroom, and everybody's screaming and yelling at each other, and like there's food smells constantly going on, and everyone's getting told off. Mum's threatening to give you a hiding with the wooden spoon if you don't do the dishes right now. So I used to work in all of that noise and vibrancy of my family home. But now that I don't live there, and I moved out, it's been I've had to adjust to just
Right.
quiet, just absolute silence. And so sometimes I'll play like a YouTube video of
Yeah.
people talking, like a podcast or something,
Yeah.
just so I can have some noise in the background, because like I can't do it if it's quiet. Like I have to have noise. A lot of writers are like, no, it has to be dead
Right.
silent. I've got to have this one lamp. And I'm like, nah, Like if my neighbors are having a party, it's a good night for me because then I can just write.
Oh, that's so crack up. That is funny. I wanted to touch upon Straight Up Islander. Sydney Writers Festival. Was it this past weekend you were part of a panel, right? That you talked about the Straight Up Islander, Australia's first online collection of articles, and I wanted to really ask you about being on these panels. I'm very curious. Well, first of all, can you just talk a little bit about Straight Up Islander, and then I'll ask you about the panel thing.
Yeah, of course. So Straight Up Islander was always a dream of mine when I first started Sweatshop, and we were first making anthologies. I always thought, wouldn't it be cool if I just got a bunch of like islanders and we all just wrote something together? But obviously it was still very early days in my career, so I had to pay my dues and actually learn how to make anthologies and learn how to put a collection together. And so after my work with Sweatshop Women wrapped up, which was the first anthology of its kind in Australia, in the fact that not only was it written by women of color, it was also edited, designed, and put together by women of color. So like on a holistic level, Sweatshop Women is kind of the first of its kind in Australia to do that. And so because I was already like with the women of color at Sweatshop already pushing boundaries and creating new things, obviously Straight Up Islander is kind of the next thing, because there hasn't been an online collection solely by Pacific Islanders in Australia on such a mainstream level. Obviously, I do have to give a shout out to the platform talanoa, that is now run, I think, by Emele Ungavule, and was started by a woman named Arita Talanoa. And they were showcasing a lot of Pacific Islander stories, actually. And so, but on a mainstream level where there was a lot of access, because SBS Voices and SBS is kind of the national broadcaster in Australia. And so it was the first of its kind in that regards to get a mainstream platform like that. And I just got together 10 writers who of Pacific Islander heritage from all across the Oceania. So Maori, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, Niue, all of that stuff. So it was just about putting a collection of our voices together and them just writing from their own lived experiences, like them really having the agency to pick a topic as to what they wanted to talk about, in terms of what it means for them to be Pacific Islander. And so obviously the first Pacifica professor in Australia, Georgie Ravulo, talked about being empowered in his difference and how he was able to become the first Pacifica professor in Australia, and what that means for our community, and the lessons he wanted to impart to our community, because he has such an incredible role in this country. And then also people like Christina For, who wanted to touch on a really serious, important topic about sexual violence and assault that a lot of Pacific Islander women have experienced and do not have the platform or the voice, or who are not given the voice or the platform to talk about a really serious subject. And then obviously Sela Ahosivi Atiola, who talked about being empowered not only as a Tongan, but also as somebody who grew up also in Mount Druitt and Blacktown, and trying to and feeling empowered by the multicultural lived experience of growing up in a low socioeconomic area in Sydney in particular. And then obviously we have from another Australia, Anne-Marie Tewil, who talked about hitchhiking back in the days in like the 80s. and basically the lessons she learned as a hitchhiker, which again is that kind of navigating wayfaring spirit that we have, that she took into another Australia as well, because she really pushed the boundaries of what a what poems and what essays and what memoir looks like together. It's really beautiful in Another Australia, the way that she was able to put all of those genres together to create this new healing thing, contribution to knowledge, based on her great uncle. And so, yeah, Straight Up Islander was such a joy to make, because it was really carving out a space for us in kind of mainstream Australian literature, which is what my work and Sweatshop's work is all about,
Hmm.
and what
So
Another Australia is all about.
yeah, I mean, so when you're on this panel, just recently at the Sydney Writers Festival, I was curious, as you're sharing about Straight Up Islander, I was wondering, who are the people in the audience? You know, like what kind of people are in the audience that are actually hearing um, the panel of these amazing folks
Yeah.
sharing.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I have to say that a event at the Sydney Writers Festival, who have been such uh, generous and gracious and respectful partners with Sweatshop and with me as a freelancer as well.
Mm,
They were the ones that reached out to me after they saw the collection on SBS. Um, who are also really, SBS is also a really generous and respectful partner as well, in the sense that they really encouraged me to create that online collection. And then this, when the Sydney Writers Festival saw it, they were like, we
mm,
totally need more Pacific Islander representation, and we haven't had the festival, to my knowledge, hasn't had a panel where it was just all Pacific Islanders, curated by a Pacific Islander, and we were all talking about literature. Like, it was
mm,
the first of its kind at the biggest literary festival in the country. So, like, that in itself was incredible. And sitting next to Annie and Christine and Georgie, and also Kea Abuaje, who is First Nations,
mm,
from South Sea Islander, Ni Vanuatu, and also Guardian. So many layers of intersections in her experience. All of us just sitting on the stage and being able to talk with each other, having that intra-personal dialogue, was really incredible. And the audience members who came were from all walks of life. Like, there
mm,
was obviously there was a bunch of other Pacific Islanders who came, which was so lovely and humbling. And they were the ones that actually got up to ask questions at the end
mm,
of the panel, because I could tell that they felt really empowered by seeing us on stage talking about stuff that they knew as well. They felt really empowered to then go up and be part of the talanoa as well, to come up and talk and to ask their questions and to give their own experiences and their own thoughts as well, which is what the talanoa is all about. And so that was really awesome. But there was also, like, just really great, like, well-meaning other people of color who are not Pacific Islander, other First Nations people, and other white people who came, and
mm,
were just so, like, they humbled themselves as well, and were really respectful and engaged as to what we were talking about, because again, it was such a it was a new thing to happen at the Sydney Writers Festival. And so I think there was a lot of excitement and generosity in the audience when they came, because there's a real hunger for Pacific Islander stories in Australia that's only growing. And so it was nice to be able to give them a little appetizer of what the next 5 years are going to look like for Pacific Islander writers in Australia.
I was getting a bit emotional there hearing that. That was, I
Oh,
had to ask, I had seen the news and I was like, oh, I have to ask about this because I'm always
thank you.
curious, but it's, oh, that's so, oh my, so empowering. Self-care. How do you take care of yourself? How do you look after yourself when you're not um, doing everything else that you usually do? Like, when do you have downtime for yourself?
Yeah. Well, like I have the privilege of kind of living out of home and looking after myself and having more time and space for myself. So I honestly just hang out with my cat, watch a bunch of YouTube, hop on Stan and Disney Plus and just watch whatever's piquing my interest. I also love reading other books. So, for instance, I'm actually reading Sonny Bill Williams' memoir
I just
called
finished
"You
it.
Can't Stop the Sun." I haven't finished it yet, but "You Can't Stop the
Yeah.
Sun from Shining," which was co-written by the author who also did Once Were Warriors.
Yeah, Alan Duff.
Obviously, I have my criticisms about it, but
Yeah.
again, Maori representation. He's Maori writer at the end of the day, and so
Mm.
it was nice to see that collaboration come together. And so that's what I'm reading at the moment. I also talk to a bunch of my mentors and my peers, especially Annie from Another Australia and
Mm.
her work, because she's also an editor. Uh, as well. And I feel like that also really comes through in her work as Another Australia, the way that she's kind of expertly
Mm.
crafted this clash of poetry and essay and memoir and photographs and all together references all together in this really beautiful way. And she's an editor as well. And so like
Mm.
when we get together, like I'm always just asking her for her
Mm.
advice and how she thinks about things and getting her perspective on stuff. And so yeah, that's kind of where my self-care is at. Learning, still being open to learning from my mentors, and then just resting and kind of um reading and watching TV and just hanging out with my cat. That's
Good, good. That's
yeah.
good to hear. So book recommendations. Do you have a book that you want to recommend? Please go ahead.
Yeah. So obviously the book that I want to mention that I don't have on me that we've been talking about is of course Another Australia. Please everybody do
Yes.
grab a copy of it either on ebook or in person if you can, and just have a read of all the wonderful stories and ideas and expert crafted contributions of these 12 writers in Another Australia that will change the way that readers actually think about Australia. And the other book I want to recommend is The Other Half of You by Michael Muhammad Ahmed, obviously the founding director of Sweatshop. Really big stuff is happening for this book. It got longlisted by the Miles Franklin
Wow.
only a couple of days ago, and the Miles Franklin is the biggest literary award in the country, and so for this book to get longlisted is really incredible. And I think he's the only Arab Australian writer to be longlisted twice for the Miles
Wow.
Franklin, which is really really huge. And it's such an important contribution to Australia because it talks about the Arab Australian Muslim community in such a heartfelt, complicated, and beautiful way. And that's how I've been able to think about how to represent Pacific Islanders in Australia in a nuanced, complicated, but beautiful way. And so, yeah, the Other Half of You is the book I would recommend along with Another Australia.
Got it. That's my next purchase is that book. I want to get it. I want to get it. I have a good
Yeah.
good feeling about it, so I want to get it. So as we begin to wrap up, thank you so much for hanging in here with me.
No, thank you so
what
much for your time and your generous and beautiful questions. It's obviously just nice to even talanoa with you and meet you, Rosa. And I really respect all the work you're doing in the podcast space and uplifting so many Pacific Islander voices and doing that really humble work. Like it's really inspiring for me to see you and talk to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, again, you beat me to it, but
No!
I appreciate you so much for coming through. Um, there's just so many takeaways from our talanoa today. I'm so glad that I came across you through Sweatshop and then started doing research and finding out that just the amazing work that you're doing and the connections and the networking with different writers. So I thank you so much for just coming onto the show and
Of
sharing
course, whenever you're in
your
Sydney,
journey.
just let me know and we'll work. Send me any writing if you have any, you know, we
But
can
yeah,
talk. I would love to work with you on an article about living in Japan. I just think that's still I still can't even wrap my head around that. So I got you, sis. Anytime,
oh,
anytime you need anything, just let me know.
thank you. Well, final words as we end the show. Guests usually drop some final gems or words of wisdom. So take it away, sis.
Yeah, I mean, the only gem that I would still love to pass on is the one that's written in another Australia. The upela mo e popo. Always be prepared for any eventuality. And if you're wanting to know how to get prepared, getting your hands on another Australia when it comes out is the way to go.